So today I wanted to connect with you to talk to you about some of my ideas about personal health, self-reflection and self-awareness. For the sake of this conversation, would you like your title to be Dr. Donna or Dr. Donna Hutchinson? What would you prefer?
I think most people that I've worked with in a medical capacity usually call me Donna or Dr. Donna.
Okay.
So either of those two work. I think the majority of people would know me as Dr. Donna.
All right, today you will be Dr. Donna. So tell me a little bit about your decision when you were younger about wanting to go into medicine.
I don't think it was something that was supposed to be my purpose until my own experience of ill health made me reconsider.
Okay.
I'd had this notion, and I don't know why, but I had this notion that I really enjoyed languages and that I wanted to be a translator or an interpreter, which back in the day and with our upbringing would have seemed quite ridiculous at the time. No more ridiculous than being a doctor, but somewhat ridiculous given that we never went abroad ever, and we never really had the opportunity to try out a different language. But there was something about it. Perhaps it was mimicry, or perhaps it was liking communication, that I thought that's what I wanted to do. And then I became unwell, and it was life-changing. It was life-changing not only for me, but also for the rest of the family, in terms of when there is one person within our family experiencing ill health, there are collateral effects in terms of the dynamic in the family, pressures on people's time, relative financial insecurities, and what everybody has to surrender in effect in order for the needs of the ill person to be met. And having had that experience, perhaps from the age of 13, and my experience of care providers and what it was like being in hospital, and how frightening it was being in hospital and not having answers in terms of what my illness was and what it represented and why I had become ill, I felt, quite frankly, and perhaps somewhat egotistically, I could do it better. And having that experience gave me the wherewithal that perhaps that was something that would be worthy of pursuing, notwithstanding our own social circumstances and background, because we, for all intents and purposes, would be considered to be in a lower socioeconomic bracket without having had anyone in the family who had trained as a doctor. So to even consider that that could be a possibility, if I had not had the experience I had, perhaps it wouldn't have been something even accessible to me at all, because of our belief systems and our conditioning and our social standing and all of those other things. So that for me was one of the earliest opportunities that I'd had to really reflect on the true nature of reality and what was a possibility.
Okay. So you've been practicing medicine in the UK with the National Health Service. So tell me a little bit about your journey through practicing medicine in the UK.
So that journey started being a patient and then transitioning from still being a patient to applying for medical schools and getting largely knocked back that it was unlikely that I would ever succeed in the high stress, high risk stake of medical practice. And it would be foolish to even consider it given my state of health at the time. And that was one of the first times that I decided that somebody else's evaluation of me wasn't true. It wasn't something I had to surrender to, that was the be all and end all, because how did they know me? I was still getting to know me.
Yeah.
So I was very fortunate in that, having been turned down by a number of different medical schools, I was accepted at one medical school on the basis that at the time they were fairly forward thinking and they could see the validity of somebody with personal experience and how that might be useful in terms of a physician. So it was tough. It was really tough. I was still navigating through being ill and going through medical studies. And always somewhat frustrated by the conventional medical model, which was very much, this is the illness and that's the end point. Not this is the diagnosis and this is the starting point. How did somebody get to this point? It was very much, and in many respects still is, much about pattern recognition of symptoms. And if there is a specific pattern that would fulfill the remit of X number of diagnostic criterion for something, then that is the diagnostic label, that is the illness label that somebody is given. And then there is typically a pharmaceutical intervention for that, and that is typically lifelong.
Okay.
And for me, that just did not make sense.
So that would have been mainstream medicine in the UK then, and do you think the US as well? So there's an approach in the US and the UK to diagnosis and treatment, and then through your evolution of medicine, you've decided to take a different approach. So what do you think that changes, and what is that approach?
So in answer to the first bit, is it the same in the US as it is in the UK? I don't have your knowledge of how the US is set up in terms of healthcare. What I do understand is the health model in terms of ICD-10 codes. So there are the pattern recognition, the symptom criterion for which a diagnostic label can be applied. And the diagnostic label is important because it allows that to be a billable item of service, which is what is needed in an insurance model. So in some respects, although healthcare is free at the point of service here in the UK, it works along a similar pattern. From my point of view, having had my own health journey and from the patients that I have served over nearly the last 3 decades, it did not make sense to me in any way, shape or form how something as incredible and sophisticated as the mind-body, which is self-organizing and self-writing, required long-term pharmaceutical support. It just did not make sense in any way, shape, or form. And they were conversations that I had with my own healthcare providers along my journey, because what typically happens is that all medication has other direct effects. We use the euphemism of side effects, but in actual fact, they have other direct effects.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those other effects can be equally as problematic for an individual as the original symptoms that they're being used to treat. And then in that regard, it requires intervention with further pharmaceuticals to suppress the collateral effects of the primary drug. Well, it seems like a nonsense. If one has a headache, it's not because we are depleting aspirin, for example. So I had conversations with some of my care providers as to why were we not looking at the bigger picture, the other facets that would keep a biological system healthy. You know, we see this in all species in terms of what things will cause their distress or their stress or their vulnerability, and what environment would allow them to thrive. And they're very simple things. You know, it really isn't rocket science. We need to be fed, we need to be watered, we need to sleep. There are so many things that are the starting point before we get into some of these adjunct therapies.
But in the model that you're describing, with intervention of medicine, which causes other issues, and then that triggers the need for more medicine and more issues, it seems like the general person is handing over their power and accountability to the medical industry rather than perhaps pursuing solutions for themselves. Do you think?
I would agree. And I've been there and I did that until my circumstances were so bad that I felt there has to be another way, because I do not want to surrender this. I'm essentially being told that this is as good as it gets for my life. And my life was pretty diminished to being bedbound, and life was on hold. But it was the narrative that was given. So this is not in any way, shape, or form discrediting any member of the general public who is simply going along with the cultural norms and the expectations of that society. You know, in the Western model, it very much is a patriarchal type of system, in that the doctor and patient relationship is very hierarchical. The doctor knows best. Well, the doctor knows best about who? Because each one of us is the expert in ourselves. And certainly the care model in the UK, in some regards, is not dissimilar to the US, in that the amount of time that you have in front of your care provider would be 10 minutes. You know, 10 minutes about something that is as precious as one's health.
Talking of 10 minutes, I had a very interesting experience with a doctor. And what happens here is, often if I have a change in insurance, then I have to change my doctor, because that doctor's not under the umbrella of the other insurance or the new insurance. I went to see my doctor, and I can't remember what was like. Oh, digestive problems. I've had ongoing digestive problems. So I went to see the doctor, and he started asking me a lot of stuff about my family history, to do with my heart, to do with stroke, to do with all these other things. And he was really determined that he needed to talk to me about that. And I was like, but I'm here about digestive problems, and I've had these problems for some time. And then he said, so do you usually like to be called Kevin? And I said, well, no. because my name is Michael. And then his nurse came in and went, oops, I think that the charts got transposed somehow or switched. And so he was looking at somebody else's charts, somebody else's history. But what was interesting about that was he was determined, even though after he realized the mistake, to continue to talk to me about that problem. And I was just like, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here about a completely different issue. But so anyway, that's just an isolated experience. But going back to what you were saying, what because you were in the NHS, then you were in a partnership, you decided that it was better for you for various reasons to not be in that partnership anymore, and you wanted to explore other aspects of medicine and other approaches to what we might call compassionate care. So what does that approach look like? What was the changing point in your mind to say, because you had a changing point in your own approach to wellness, and in that changing point in your own approach to wellness, maybe that led to more thought and a decision to have a different approach to other people's wellness. What does that look like now?
I certainly have more freedom now than I used to. But I have always tried to adopt an approach to patients that I would have wanted. So I think even from the start, when I was in my general practice partnership, I met patients where they were. And what I mean by that was I knew what it was like to be talked down to. I knew what it was like to have my own concerns dismissed as inconsequential. But they were the things that I needed to talk about. And so the patients that I had the absolute privilege to support, and I mean that sincerely, I felt that they were my biggest teachers. For me, going through medical school gave me a foundational knowledge. But when I went into primary care, so family medicine here in the UK, having done my internship in various roles in the hospital, for me, it was a sudden realization that it could be a collaboration, that patients, while they may not have a medical degree and they may not have the specific language that we had been schooled in medical school, had very specific words that could describe what their experience was. And the very specific words, and I thought this was quite wonderful, were often coming from their subconscious. So they might describe something in an interesting way. And I had this lovely realization that this person, this one version of me, and there's been many different versions of me, who had wanted to be a translator, was actually getting to do that. And in meeting patients where they were, using the language that they had given me, because it was their language, one of the things I loved doing was explaining people's experience to them in language that they could understand. And there was something about that when we explored together perhaps some of the challenges that they were facing, or perhaps the lack of support that they may have, or their concerns or their vulnerabilities. We moved it away from trying to fix somebody and telling them what they should do, to having a much more profound understanding that somebody wasn't broken, They were simply having a human experience or on a particular part of their journey. And they would often be able to, when invited and supported in a non judgmental and a compassionate way, come up with their own solutions. I mean, that's just fantastic. If somebody can come up with their own solutions, they're not being imposed on them. It's much more likely that that individual, seeing the validity of those actions in wanting to affect an outcome, and that they were actions that they could reasonably take, there's much more likelihood that they would follow that. We often have emotive language in medicine, and it might be patient was given a treatment schedule X. At the return visit, patient is non-compliant with the treatment. For example, the patient didn't want to take the medication, or maybe they couldn't afford the medication. Maybe the medication gave them side effects and it was intolerable. And for me, the non-compliance wasn't that that person was trying to be difficult. It was simply that the doctor and the patient had two completely different agendas.
Yeah. Or that, like you said, the agenda seemed the same, but the possible action and outcomes were not going to be the result for the patient.
Most of our communication is miscommunication.
Yeah.
And we just hope enough of it lands for the other person that they have received the message that we wanted to impart. But we make lots of assumptions through life. And it's really about checking. And one of the things I started to do was to ask somebody if I could, having listened to their story, retell it to them in order so that I could check my own understanding, and in order in that space, in the same space where we're meeting, for them to guide me as to where I might have had a misunderstanding, or where I may not have acknowledged something that was important to them. That's the starting point.
I don't think that many of my experiences here in the US with doctors, apart from when Liam was younger, we had a really good family doctor. And I could have these kind of conversations with him. We'd talk about his ideas on vaccinations, his ideas on various medications and stuff. But we could have a dialogue, a two-way conversation, instead of the rest of my experience has been, hello, Mr. Hutchinson, what's going on? Oh, this is going on. Well, based on this, you need to just do this, and here's the medicine. Or I'm visiting you about this. Oh, well, we've noticed this. You should take this medication. And then I would say 9 times out of 10, I don't take the medication. Although I'm not having like critical diagnoses. I'm having like, oh, well, you've got slight cholesterol, or you've got this, or you've got that. Well, okay, well, if I look at my family history, many able-bodied, healthy people who have had a longer life than me have got slightly high cholesterol levels, and they don't take any medications. So, I've been thinking more and more, and you and I have conversations about this, about elements of self-health, and to be able to process them, I kind of put them into buckets of self. So I have body, spirit, and mind. I wanted to talk to you, because we don't have time really to dive deeply into all of them, because they're pretty in-depth topics. Talk about mind, and that kind of connects maybe to spirit a little bit. So you talked about when you're talking to patients, if they have the right direction, maybe an agreed plan, and the right mindset maybe about it, they can often find their self back to wellness, because the body is this magical biological machine that can come up with a lot of the things that it needs to do. So let's talk about mind, because I think we were just talking about technology and the stresses of technology. So stress is obviously a big part of daily life. And I think a lot of people struggle with their mind, whether it's kind of an inner critic, or as I call monkey mind, where you wake up in the middle of the night and it's just chattering. Talk to me about some of the things that you've been doing in your personal life in discovery of healthy mind, or quietening the mind, and then how that transitions into conversations that you might have with your patients.
So how long have we got? Mind is it can be our greatest enemy. And it can be our greatest enemy because we all have an internal dialogue. And it can be like having a really annoying roommate where there is constant criticism, constant negative chatter, and many, many thoughts. And the thing about thoughts are that they're not true. They're not necessarily true at all. And what I discovered for myself, but I also discovered for my patients, is that the significant challenges and stress everyone went through during COVID, and for many people, financial insecurities or loss of connection with other people or working from home, there was a lot more time for mental chatter with nowhere for it to go. And in the fast-paced world we live in, and technologies, social media platforms, instant answers, and scrolling has meant for many people that they are not able to sit with their thoughts. And we can sometimes determine that emotions are good emotions or bad emotions, when in actual fact, they're simply emotions. And all emotions are welcome because there has to be the extremes of emotion to be able to get the full spectrum of experiences and life. And when I found myself, as I have under several occasions, having issues with my own mental health and being diagnosed with clinical depression and having suicidal ideation, one of the things that facilitated my recovery was being able to sit with those emotions, being able to allow that I might have those deeply disturbing and depressing thoughts, including at times the suicidal ideation, and not acting on that. And part of the process of being able to ride that out or move beyond it was some of the self-reflection work on the who am I? And some of that included doing meditation. And meditation, it simply means to become familiar with. Most of us, because of the busyness of life, have never had the opportunity to sit with ourselves and ask some of those bigger picture questions and sit with what comes up as well.
But there's sort of a foundational place, I think, almost required to be able to do that. So for me, looking at my life, so many things in my life to do with my thoughts or my emotions were seeking out something. I wasn't really sure what it was, just the pursuit of something to fill an emptiness or to answer a question or to feel some sort of self-worth. And I think once I acknowledged that in myself and I could start to understand my own self-worth and how valuable my own company was, then I could sit with my own thoughts. I think a lot of people are, not just because of technology, they're avoiding these thoughts because sometimes they're destructive, or for any number of reasons. They inspire emotions that are not comfortable or are not healthy. And of course we can dive into trauma. We can talk about trauma because it probably will go back to that as well. But many people have built a life to never sit alone with their thoughts, to never have that reflection. But that also, I mean, it gets very complicated because that also then ties into the idea that they're continuously looking outward for validation, which is terrible in a digital world because there's so much negative chatter or criticism. I'm not sure that there's a question to this. I'm just talking. Maybe the question is, how do you begin that? How do you begin the process of, if you're not very self-reflective, or if you don't have time, or if you're not even allowing time, how do you begin to have a healthy mind? Because I think that when I talk about body, spirit, and mind, a lot of it starts with the mind.
I think for many people, they do not come to that realization until they are at rock bottom. There is something about having the scales lifted from one's eyes, so to speak, that then provides an opportunity to do the work, because it's a case of things are so bad they couldn't be any worse. And it is incredibly difficult to try and get somebody else to see the value of doing the work until they come to that realization themselves. And that's usually on the back of some sort of an awakening that they've had. And that will be different for every person. You know, we do not see the world as it is. We see the world through the lens with which we are looking at it. So if your map of the world is your map of the world, somebody inviting you to a particular location that's on their map of the world, they'll be lost. They will get lost. What I would hope is that conventional medicine, and I'm not diminishing the role of conventional medicine at all. Conventional medicine absolutely comes into its own in terms of cases of acute trauma, so orthopedics and trauma, or in the aftermath of someone having had a stroke or a heart attack or sepsis. It's absolutely vitally important. But what I would really love to see is a paradigm shift in the health arena. And this would have to start at a very early level and at a societal level, in terms of what really do we mean by health? Because it's taken for granted until you don't have it. Or it's taken for granted until somebody in your family is navigating through a health challenge. And it's at that point when people seeking answers may be receptive to learning about different ways. And unfortunately, that's simply the situation that we're in at the moment.
Or learning specifically about themselves, because that avoidance technique or avoidance mentality has meant that they are not sitting with their thoughts or working through their thoughts.
And going back to some of the things that I was saying about my depression, at one point when I was first starting in medicine, used to have this concern that how would I broach a subject like suicidality? There was something about that I had this little notion that, goodness, if I bring that up, is that more likely that that individual will suddenly have those thoughts? And my own experience with depression taught me that that was complete nonsense, because they are thoughts that many people have. And having an open conversation about it, and it not being that there's going to be a punitive measure in that somebody having the courage to say, actually, yes, that is how I'm feeling. It really opened up wider channels of communication to say, it's okay to not be okay. And I, at one point, tied myself up in knots over this professional persona, that it had been drummed into me that I must keep up this professional persona at all times. And there were certain behaviors that were not befitting of anyone in the medical profession. And those behaviors, quite frankly, to me, meant that you took out the human element of it. And the human aspect of it is that we are vulnerable. We have messy lives. We make mistakes. We're not perfect. And there was a particular patient that I had been supporting who was clinically depressed. And we were having the tick box exercise of asking the appropriate questions to make sure that they weren't at particular risk of harming themselves. And on paper, this person would be, for want of a better expression, safe. And they were about to leave my room, and I had one of those moments of gut intuition that said, this person's not okay. Don't let them leave your room, because they're not okay.
Yeah.
And I invited them to sit back down, and I said, I rarely share this with patients. In fact, I have never done so. But I have been in the situation that you now find yourself, and reflecting on that, I know how it feels, but I also know the shame that I felt in feeling that I wasn't good enough, wasn't resilient enough, could not cope, and that I was somehow less of a person as a result of that. And as I continued the conversation with this person, I said, and what I realized was I just needed to survive the next moment, and then the next moment, and then the next moment. All we have, all of us, is this next moment? And can we be present in this moment? And I said, and when you do that enough times, you get through another night and the sun comes up again and you get to start over. And that's how I got out of my severe depression. And he left. And he had been accompanied by his wife at the time. And the following day, his wife came to the surgery and asked to speak to me. And I made some time to speak to her. And she said, "Thank you for what you shared yesterday. I believe you saved my husband's life, because when we got home, it was the first time he had openly acknowledged to me just how bad he felt. And he allowed himself to express his emotions, including crying." And there's something about crying, and particularly for men, that is often seen as inappropriate. Well, it isn't inappropriate. It's an emotion, and it's a movement of an emotion that allows the body and the mind to process that. And I think we should honor and acknowledge that. So there are many aspects as I've journeyed through life and journeyed with patients, thinking this idea of who I was supposed to be, and that this was largely given to me by the medical profession, is not the me that's authentic. And with each passing year, I have a little bit more courage to try things differently. And I'm always learning.
Well, and you mentioned about men and emotions and crying, and I've thought about this a number of times, not necessarily just about crying. I think it's the same for men and women with this regard, that asking for help is a very difficult thing to do, or expressing to somebody close to you something that you might perceive as being negative, but you don't really know where you got that idea from. You just think, by expressing this is going to be negative. I'll give you an example. So for me, realizing that quiet time is hugely important for me. Alone time is hugely important for me at my age now, but it never used to be because I didn't allow it. But now I need it because I'm very much an introvert. So saying to people that are close to me, I don't want to be around you is a really difficult thing, as is saying, I'm having a really bad day, can you help me? And what does that help look like? The help might just be as simple as, will you listen to what's on my mind at this moment? So yeah, I think you're right. It's you created the environment to have that dialogue, but most of the time that environment's not there, or most of the time the courage within the individual is not there to say the things they want or need to say, or to ask for help, because it just doesn't seem like it's okay to do so.
And I think that's when community support comes in, and having good friendships comes in. There's this seemingly a requirement, and fortunately it's bypassed me. I was going to say my generation, but that may not be so. It's bypassed me, that need to be liked on multiple social media platforms. And to me, that is not a reality that feels right for me. I have very few friends, but they're very close friends. And so we have continued in our friendships because we have navigated through miscommunications and repaired any ruptures in our relationships as a result of miscommunications. And the current trend for online messaging, There's very little you can get from reading something from a text message. It doesn't have the nuance of the voice, the intonation, or anything else. And doing an emoji at the end to say, well, this is laughing or whatever, I'm sorry, but that's not something that I cope with. And in terms of, can we ask for help? This is when discernment is important and clarity is important. So, as an example, I have a friend who's going through some difficulties, and they might send a message that says, "Hi, how are you?" And I realized for this person, that message, "Hi, how are you?" was code for, "I'm not okay, can you phone me?"
Yeah.
And when we can make ourselves vulnerable in a relationship, and I'm not talking necessarily an intimate relationship, I'm talking about in our friendship groups, it is not necessary to be surrounded by, I have so many hundreds of friends. It's a case of, I've got 5 fantastic friends, and I know they're the go-to person for that. And they've got my back and I've got their back. Or they're the go-to person for that. And they also know me and they accept me, all of me. So I would say that I'm also an introvert, and lots of people say, no, you're not, because you can talk to anyone. If we're out in a group, you can talk to anybody. Well, I know that of you as well, Michael. But I suddenly reach saturation and then wish that I could be teleported to my own room of quiet, because I'm done. I'm completely saturated. And I have wonderful friends that I could prime for that, to say, I was feeling quite tired today, but I really wanted to just come down and meet up with everybody. But I think I'm going to stay for about an hour and then I'm going to go home because, I know that I'll have reached saturation point at that time. I think if we can prime it, because otherwise we are making assumptions about somebody else. We're filling in the blanks of how they may be perceiving that. And most of it isn't true. It's just this mind chatter that goes on. That's, they're a bit off with me now. And what did I say? And, I haven't got the energy to second guess every single thought that is in someone else's mind. But in any communication between two people, and I've said this to you before, there are 4 minds in that conversation. There's your conscious mind and their conscious mind. And there's your subconscious and their subconscious. And those subconscious are programming will be triggered under certain circumstances. So we just need to make sure that we've got sufficient communication that lands for the other person, that we know that we can have the kind of deeper, meaningful conversations that I wish were more available in the world that we live in. Often they're not. Often people navigate at a certain level of superficial niceties rather than perhaps some of the deeper dive conversations, because there's some vulnerabilities in saying what we perhaps really think or feel.
Well, and the digital world doesn't seem to accept two sides to a coin, two sides to an issue, two sides to a debate. Like, debate seems to be going away because people tend to be positioning themselves in groups, online groups that support a particular agenda or a particular viewpoint, when really the greatest things that we learn is from being open to the idea that there are different thoughts or opinions than our own. So,
I mean, that's so true, but this comes into somebody's mental flexibility. And you can have mental flexibility and be open to hearing someone else's opinion about things. You don't have to agree with the opinion at all. I mean, this is simply somebody's opinion based on their map of the world, their belief systems, and everything else. But I think that that is one of the wonderful things about being human, that in a safe environment, and that's the key, the environment has to be safe to be supportive of having those dialogues.
well, and at the simplest level, and that's just between two people. So you need to engage with a person knowing that they're receptive to the idea that you have your own thoughts and opinions, and likewise give them the space to do the same. But often what happens is you might already know that it's not safe to have particular opinions. There's certain topics that you have to avoid, or and I think that goes back to really close friends, that you can say what you mean and they'll accept it.
Yeah.
So back to mind again as one of the components of wellness. What would you say is something that people could practice if they wanted to have a healthier mind? That's a bit of a challenging topic.
So the easiest one, I think, an entry level point for everybody, because we all do it, is breathing.
Okay.
And that sounds really stupid and simplistic, but let me explain. The autonomic nervous system is all the back office capabilities of the body that become automated. So they are under subconscious awareness. We don't have to think about them. And that's fantastic, because it means that we can run multiple different programs all at the same time. And that's simply automated. It's efficient. It just does what it's designed to do. But we live in a fast-paced world, and we are often under considerable amounts of stress. Now, when we are in stress, we have the propensity to react rather than respond. And reacting is very different from responding. When we react, it is typically that the emotional center of the brain, the amygdala, is looking for threat. And if it perceives something as threat, it doesn't matter if it's real or it's perceived, the response in the body is the same. We go into a state of sympathetic fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And we can say things that we don't mean, or take action that is not sensible in the cold light of day. And part of that is that the thoughts or the experiences or the inputs that we're having are decoded incorrectly by our survival brain, and it's about keeping us alive. Whatever the consequences, it's about keeping us alive in the moment. And that creates a high level of arousal, releasing cortisol and adrenaline. Typically, we will start to breathe rapidly and with shallow breaths, and our blood pressure goes up and our pulse goes up. However, if in that moment we take some deep breaths in and out. And some people will do box breathing. So the same breath, inhalation, exhalation, considering the size of a box. So it could be 5, 5, 5, 5. Or people can do something called 4, 7, 8 breathing. So they breathe in for the count of 4, hold their breath for the count of 7, and then take a slow breath out for the count of 8. Both of these work because by doing that for several minutes, we are regulating our nervous system. We are taking a pause. We're taking a time out so we can reevaluate and reappraise the situation. And during those few minutes of focusing our attention on our breath, the amount of adrenaline that's been released and the amount of cortisol that's been released in the body starts to subside, such that by 2.5 minutes, it's about half what it was. And at 5 minutes, that cortisol and adrenaline surge has been dissipated. At that point, we've given ourselves sufficient amount of time that rather than driving wildly out of control with our foot on the accelerator, at which point we're going to cause an accident or we're going to crash, we've actually allowed ourselves to either pull over and off the highway or apply the brake and come to a steady stop. That few minutes of breath work allows us to go back to logical thinking brain that says, what's truly happening here? I was just triggered, but actually, what is truly happening here and how should I respond? Now, we can be triggered many, many times a day. You can be cut up when you're driving. And maybe somebody's got to get somewhere in a hurry. Or maybe they're just a bit of a idiot. You don't know.
Yeah.
Do you really want to waste your energy on their life? When you could just get yourself settled back into neutrality. And I'm not saying this is easy. And I'm saying sometimes I have to practice this many, many times a day because life can be tricky. But I don't want to surrender those parts of myself to something else.
Yeah, I see that in my own behavior and in other people's behavior where you have to decide, I think, in your daily life that you're doing things sort of a different perspective. So I'll give you an example. If I'm walking along and I see somebody and I want to show them friendliness or I want to show them kindness, so I say, hello, how's your day going? Or I smile or I wave a little bit, but they don't reciprocate. If I get bent out of shape because they didn't reciprocate, then it's a pointless activity because I'm going to continue going through my daily life getting bent out of shape quite often instead of making the decision that that's how I want to behave and I'm just happy with myself for behaving in that way.
Absolutely. And you can continue in that frame of mind. And if somebody was otherwise distracted, so they didn't see you, so they didn't acknowledge you, that's fine. People have got stuff going on. Other times, people might meet your eye and give you a smile back or say hello back. And that small interaction, that tiny little microdose of kindness in a day, that's better than many of the pharmaceuticals that are out there, and it's free.
But that goes back to what we were talking about, being brave enough to do some of these things, because interactions, you can see this when you go into big cities. It used to be that if you went to London, before the digital age, everybody was holding up their newspaper and effectively hiding behind it because they don't want to interact, because interactions could lead to vulnerability, and vulnerability could lead to threat. Like maybe somebody's going to try to mug you, maybe somebody's going to try to build some sort of confrontation. So I think a lot of these interactions are lost through self-protection, or going back to vulnerability, not wanting to be vulnerable in any way. And being vulnerable could be that it will really hurt your feelings that they don't respond. Very complicated.
It is very complicated. I think that the more I navigate through life, the more I think, okay, I'm responsible for me. In my medical role, clearly I have other responsibilities, and I have responsibilities to other people, but I can't do to other people. They have to be on board with that. And in the same way as I'm navigating through life, I want to go through life with as much ease as I can. So I want to be me. I'm responsible for me, and I'm accountable to me. And the more we feel comfortable with the knowing that who we are is not based on those factors outside of ourselves, but are innate, the more we can go through life with relative ease.
But that is the paradox of the mind, in that the mind can be your best friend or your worst enemy, depending on where you are in your day or in your life. I think that one of the things that helps me, which I don't do enough, is the idea of the power of thought, the power of my thoughts, and that although there are many thoughts that I can't control, there are some thoughts that I can initiate. So I can say at the beginning of the day, I can say, you know, Michael, today's going to be a really great day. It's going to be full of opportunity, and you're going to have a really nice day. Like, I can be positive, even though maybe I'm not feeling that way. But that seems to help. Do you see any of that in your life or in patients, that by positioning yourself with a particular mindset, it can be empowering?
It can be very empowering. And the reason for that is that thoughts are the language of the brain, but feelings are the language of the body. And every thought we have, if we pay attention to the thought, it has an effect on the neurotransmitters in the brain. And that has an effect on the master glands in the brain, which direct the secretion of various hormones from the hormone producing glands in the body. So the mind and the body are intrinsically interlinked. It's not two separate entities. And so you're right. If you wake up in the morning and as soon as you open your eyes, you plug yourself back into all of the frustration and the irritation and the distress that you had the day before, well, you're just replaying that day. When in actual fact, when you open up your eyes, first of all, isn't that wonderful because you're alive?
Yeah.
We don't know how long we've got.
That's one of my friends says all the time when I ask him how he is. He's like, well, I've got another day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not everyone gets to say that. You know, come on. And we can make that a jokey thing, but it's absolutely true. So first of all, you're alive. You also have a brand new day to start over. There is nothing yet in that day that is absolutely determined. And we are at the end of everything that we've discussed here, energetic beings. So you have much more agency over the energetic signature that you want to broadcast. And you can start with the words that you choose to say to yourself and about yourself. And it's almost setting your intention for the day. This is amazing. I've woken up. I'm still alive. You know, it's let's not have a Groundhog Day here.
Mm-hmm.
Even in that, there was some learning in terms of actually, things can improve. What's your outlook? What are you broadcasting? And that's another thing that people can do. Sometimes people say, well, that's not for me. Okay, or could you try it? Or sometimes people say, well, it's not working. And the whole thing of it's not working, am I just not doing it properly? It's something that you are. You don't just do it, you be that change that you want to see. Nobody would sit and say, well, I changed my mindset and then wonderful opportunities landed in my lap. It doesn't work like that. It's about changing one's mindset to have more accessibility to the creative part of ourselves that allows us to see that we are worthy of opportunities and that we are worthy of achieving our full potential. That's what it's about. It's not about simply affirmations for simply saying affirmations. It's about who is it that I want to be? And what do I have to become in order to be that version of myself? And to know that one is worthy of those things. If we go into that and we're still caught up in the narrative of everything that's happened before for us, and so we're very closed in terms of what we can receive, then we aren't open to receive anything else that might come our way. And so that would be the invitation for people, that wherever they are on their journey, know that they are worthy of a good life, and that they are enough, and that they are empowered to affect those changes themselves.
Well, and that really goes back to what you said before about coping with dark times, that you just get through the next moment. So if you want change in your thinking, in your life, in your health, then just remember that you have this moment, and then you have this moment, and then you have this moment, and try to make more of those individual moments align with what it is that you're trying to achieve. With
and this is it. It's a case of, well, rather than having a goal, the smart objectives of achieving the goal, which doesn't really have a firm fixed, this is what is going to happen. It's a case of, what is my outcome? What outcome do I want to affect? Back in the day, my outcome was, I want to be a doctor because I think I could be better at it than some of the physicians that I've had. Okay, well, how do I need to get there? Well, first of all, I need to be able to get out of bed. I need to be able to walk. I need to put on weight. I need to do this. So it's a case of, okay, who do I need to be in order to achieve that, which is achievable? And it's doing those little habit stackers of, well, okay, in order to get from A to B, I've got to take the steps. I've got to have a system in place. I know what my orientation is. I want to head in that direction. This is my North Star, regardless of what curveballs life throws me, because it will. That is what I want to draw to me. And that is what I'm going to meet by heading in that direction.
I think a lot of people give up through overwhelm, though. So when you described that process, you said, I want to go into medicine and this is my reason. And there's lots of steps. I mean, that's a long journey. But I think for many people, they encounter overwhelm too early on in the journey because they try to do too much at the beginning of the journey.
as they say, everybody's got their Everest. So Mount Everest, everybody's got their Everest. But the journey starts with a single step. And then you put one foot in front of the other. And when you put one foot in front of the other and you head in a certain direction, there comes a point where there is less of the journey ahead of you than you have already accomplished and have behind you. And in terms of, for example, going through my really dark times with being depressed, or where some people might find themselves, lots of the really good work in ourselves and in the world happens in the darkness. And once you're in the darkness, it's a case of coming out the other side of it. It's I'm so far into this now that it is easier for me to journey on through this than it is to try and fight my way back. And sometimes people have said to me, this particular thing happened in my life and I just want to be the person that I used to be. But if we have gone through something significant in life, that person doesn't exist anymore. There is a new iteration of oneself. And that happens for all of us throughout our life.
But if we tie something to a trauma event, it's sticky, like it follows you with its stickiness until in your mind and your emotions and spirit you can discern that that isn't you anymore. But I think that that's a very difficult thing.
There are many, many people who will have had a traumatic experience, and that's a whole different topic in and of itself in terms of acknowledging the validity of that and how people are affected by that. And a traumatic experience or multiple experiences create a different physiology in the body. It's not about somebody's level of resilience or their ability to cope or anything else. It's a survival mechanism that was adaptive in the moment that becomes maladaptive in the long term. And that can really shape how people navigate through life because it gives them a very different map of the world. And in terms of, is it possible to heal from traumatic experiences, or is it possible to do the work on those aspects of self that have been traumatized? The answer is yes, and it is not necessary to open the Pandora's box, so to speak, to put some of those aspects of self to bed. I mean, it isn't. Many of those things will be deeply entrenched in the subconscious mind, and they have been hidden away, or they direct certain aspects of our behavior as a means of self-preservation. And one could argue that however destructive those behaviors may seem to an outside observer, they have only ever been benevolent because the individual is still alive. So whatever purpose that particular behavior or way of being served, it has fulfilled its obligation because that person has survived. But this is the thing. There was a quote from a particular person, and forgive me that I cannot cite who the quote is from, but it was in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and it was considered that there were two groups of survivors, two groups of people, if you like. There were those who did not die, and there were those who came back to life.
Hmm.
That's two very different things. It's which people, regardless of the experiences that they've had that can have been deeply traumatizing, damaging in every way imaginable, of those people who found meaning in life, that they were able to move past that and live again.
Well, we can continue to unpack very deep topics. I think we should wrap this one up for today. And I'll think about what we might talk about next time. I'm sure that we can connect again and dive into more body, spirit, mind aspects. So,
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
I appreciate everything that you have to contribute to this conversation.
Okay. Bye for now.